Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much, Asipe. Welcome to this event, which is the first of the series that Konrad Adenauer Foundation is doing together with Conrad. So my duty here is to introduce the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, just to tell you a little bit about the kind of work that we do. So Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a political foundation which focuses on the promotion of democracy, good governance, and strengthening of the rule of law. We provide funding to diverse organizations, including universities and think tanks. We also commission papers, books, and provide funding for research. Just last week, we had an event which was titled Poor Education, Poor Economy, and Planning the Escape. It was based on a paper written by Professor Berger from the University of the Free State. Basically, in short, the paper was about how high unemployment rate is as a result of inequality and poor education outcomes in South Africa. He also mentioned a bit about how the poor infrastructure at school affects the learning outcomes of the learners. I will post a link to the paper in the chat box if you're interested to read the full version. So the foundation also offers scholarships for master's students in humanities, but the scholarship is only available at UCT and WITS. It is combined with an internship at the South African Institute of International Affairs. The advantage of this scholarship is that students earn an income while studying, and they also gain work experience. If you're interested to know more about this scholarship, please check our website, which is cas.de. You'll get all the information. We also have a parliamentary research program, which is a 9-month internship in Parliament. At Parliament, the interns get a monthly stipend. Unfortunately, the applications will be closing tonight at midnight. I'll put a link in the chat box, which will lead you straight to the application page. If you know anyone who will be interested in such an internship, please forward them the link. They'll be able to apply, but it has to be done today until midnight tonight. Let me take this opportunity to thank Sonabo and the colleagues at Conrad for organizing this event. And I also would like to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists who are going to share valuable information with us. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for the warm welcome to this virtual space and for the presentation of the work done by CAS with so many opportunities that young people should take advantage of. Today, we are here to discuss the role of youth in democratic resilience, particularly at times of COVID-19. But before we start the conversation, we have in the house Uphakama Mlokoti. Uphakama Mlokoti is a South African poet and national slam champion, currently based in Cape Town. Her debut collection of poetry is forthcoming late this year. Phakama will share some of the poems or a poem for us today. Over to you, Phakama.
Thank you so much, Asipe. 1. On the eve of my aunt's burial, I stood cross-legged on a bus to Butterworth, trying to secure connection to the internet. Last night, they told us the funeral would be live streamed for those who could not attend, and my heart sank to the floor. My larger-than-life aunt, who cried louder than everyone at funerals, who rocked black shades and flamboyant hats and badly done makeup. My aunt, who seemed almost incapable of death, and what a small way for her to leave the earth. 2. Where I come from, it is important to cleanse our dead, to hold their bodies and wash them clean, to pick out the clothes we wish to bury them in. In this, there is honor. In this, there is healing. When my grandmother died, the whole family went to view her face for the last time. We did the same for my uncles, stayed up the whole night sharing passionate eulogies and singing hymns that they cherished in life, brought them back home to make sure their spirits did not wander in their afterlife. And yet, What of my aunt, whose coffin was snuck in through a hole in the garden, whose coffin we could not see until it was deep down in the earth? Where I come from, we pour soil over the graves of our dead. We burn sage around their tombstones, give our Black people the respect in death that they were deprived of in life. 3, it is hard to mourn. More so, it is hard to mourn by the rules, to feel the sting of loss eating at your insides, knowing it is against the rules to hold, knowing it is against the rules to be held. The day of the funeral, my dad stands by the gate with a bottle of sanitizer. His hands shake as he welcomes everyone with his elbow. The absence of physical touch is traumatic in moments of grief. The counting of our heads, deciding who is close enough to be present, is traumatic in moments of grief. Watching your aunt's burial on a live stream video is traumatic in a moment of grief. 4, I fear that our send-offs have become impersonal. I fear that our send-offs have become cold. I fear we have lost our burial rites, and soon our children will not know what it means to hold night vigils, to sing in unison for our dead until the pain leaves our bodies, to put flowers around their coffins, to say our final words until there's nothing left to feel or say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phakama, for sharing your art with us. The pandemic has indeed displaced our emotions, especially in the moments of grief and the grieving in isolation. The pandemic has exposed the conditions of democracy and human rights in many countries and many spaces. Colleagues, we are about to start with our conversation and hear from our contributors today. Kindly note that you can use the chat section to post questions for the speakers. We will only allow for the question and answer and read your questions and comments after all the speakers have shared their contributions. Colleagues, again, I would like to plead with you to please switch off your mics and switch off your videos. Kindly note that the session will start now and it will end at about 5. Today, we are joined by Untombo Vuyolinda, who is a project developer at Hubs of Convergence, Pedro Mzileni, who is a lecturer at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Nelson Mandela University, Unoluthando Onono, who is a student of Information and Systems at UJ, and also an Elite Mages Africa Youth Network. We also have Uyandisa Jobase, who comes from the Center for Women in Gender Studies and also a student at Nelson Mandela University. Lastly, we have Ulave Lamgidlana, who works at Grassridge Community Trust. We will start with Unoluthando Onono to share her contributions. Over to you, Nolthando.
Thank you so much, Asipe. And it is quite a daunting task to speak in reference to the questions that surround democracy and also surround the importance of young people when it comes to COVID-19. I think there is major disconnect between the identity that is youth and any action that tends to move towards creating some or other kind of solution when it comes to COVID-19. And a lot of this is because the discussions of COVID-19, the understanding of COVID-19 and how it plays itself out in the world is something that more often than not has become either an academic practice or a governmental discussion that somewhat precludes the general society and can sometimes become very difficult to deal with. And so I'm going to try and just break my thoughts on this down in 3 particular ways. The first one is just to look at the medical fraternity and what exactly that looks like in terms of how young people respond to COVID-19. Secondly, I think we have quite a number of questions on collaboration and the kind of opportunities that exist and what those opportunities require before they can even become something that we can have a look at as being important in this time. And lastly, around the questions of education and what exactly is education in this time and how far we can be able to stretch the impacts of that very education. So to start off with this idea, insofar as it relates to the medical fraternity, I think there are a number of changes that are probably going to need to happen in the medical fraternity from COVID-19 going forward. And I think a lot of this is something that is going to attach itself significantly to the outlook that we have in terms of what that fraternity does for the state, what that fraternity does for the people. And I think the most important aspect of this is, one, the change in the outlook of what it means for an individual to enter that fraternity, because it is an incredibly exclusive fraternity. And I think that is not to say that fraternities should not have standards. It's just to say that the arbitrary nature of just how exclusive it can be is something that tends to make it incredibly difficult for people to be able to access it, even in the instance where them being able to do so is something that's valuable. And this speaks quite importantly to the fact that at the very start of this pandemic and its entry into South Africa, there had to be a requirement for more people, which meant that we needed to accept having another country had to bring in their doctors to try and assist, which is something that speaks to the capacity of the fraternity to be able to ensure that when something like this happens, we have an effective response. It's important to also note, though, that the work of the fraternity has been incredible during this time with so much that they've had to deal with, but it's definitely clear that there has to be greater access to the medical fraternity for people who want to become doctors, etc. That there has to be a degree to which we're able to ensure that there's a strategy to, one, recruit young talent into the space that is a cornerstone to the continuation of life on this planet and is a cornerstone for the continuation of the innovation around things like the medical fraternity as well. I think the second thing to say here then is that it goes back to things like ensuring that that access, not only financially, but also in terms of just tangible capacity to ensure that people can survive within the time that they would need to become doctors and nurses, etc., and actually get success in all of that, which is also a discussion that happens frequently when it comes to things like education. Secondary, though, I think, is then the discussion around education and why that is something that becomes valuable. I think the discrepancies between schools are something that became very, very clear during COVID-19, where some schools were able to switch to online learning and ensure that their students were able to continue. Some schools were not. Capacity in terms of finance, in terms of things like the budgets that the education sector is given on a regular, are also things that are going to start to have to become more than just discussions about whether or not we can afford to put them in a budget, but discussions about how do we best ensure that the budget that exists is one that we can stretch well enough that young people can access the very best of education systems to allow them the capacity to be able to, one, reach the potential that we need them to do so, but secondly, what it is that needs to happen in order for us to be able to facilitate the necessary kinds of mechanisms that would make that education something that is worthwhile. Two things on this, though. The first is that if you pay attention to the general fiscal policies in South Africa and how things play out, you'll realize that there is a significant decline in the way in which we facilitate the budget, and as well as in terms of the amount of money that we're willing to give into education. This is something that has been a concern for some time. And the reason why it becomes a concern, especially in instances like this, is because it means that you cannot talk about things like an evolution, a third industrial revolution, a fourth industrial revolution. You can't talk about things like being able to move into an innovative space that directs that kind of education when you cannot fund that innovative space. The importance of this is to say that young people specifically in this instance are only as equipped as is possible insofar as it relates to what is accessible to them when it comes to the kind of resources that they need to facilitate the kind of interactions that they would have with education in a way that is going to be meaningful. So we can get 7 A's, but what do those 7 A's mean when you aren't able to access the capacity to use those 7 A's to enter into the medical fraternity, because the payment for first year as a medical student is something that you can't possibly pay for, and the continued growth and hikes in tuition fees is something that would still continue to preclude you from being able to access that very medical fraternity. So we need to change the outlook on what it means to invest in education, because an investment in education is not financial. It's not just financial. An investment in education would be something that facilitates the capacity of individuals to be able to, one, be better off, but secondly, to bring more into the space that they exist within. And lastly, on the idea of collaboration and opportunity, I think this is also something that hinges largely on the capacity of individuals to be able to leverage this time. So for someone who has capacity to access the internet, someone who has capacity to access networks that give them the space to be able to relate with other individuals, to collaborate, to develop certain things, to utilize this time to be able to bring about innovative solutions, that is something that has been that has allowed for us to facilitate some degree of innovation during this time. However, it is also something that attaches itself to various issues and requires a lot of discussion, or at the very least a lot of action towards ensuring that that access is something that can be made greater in this particular sense. And lastly, I think, what does then all of this then mean for a young democracy, or even just any democracy for that matter? It means two things. It means, one, the question of education needs to be answered in a way that doesn't seek to be bureaucratic, in a way that doesn't seek to make things as simple or simplified as possible. Policies need to be created in a way that is going to facilitate an actual the amount of money that we're willing to give into education. This is something that conditions for students, the necessary kind of conditions for the kind of professionals that we're trying to create. And lastly, that access needs to be something that is more than just rhetoric, and is something that we act and move towards by, one, allowing young people to have access to mechanisms of innovating, but also ensuring that those democracies are directly active in being able to ensure that those opportunities for collaboration are ones that can be accessed by young people. So in the way that that functions is that it means that there have to be direct engagements with young people. I think Rwanda does this very well with their youth ministry, which is something that a lot of countries could probably enjoy, or at the very least benefit something from. So just those are my thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noluthando, for your contribution, particularly how the pandemic has exposed the friable nature of our health system and for our education system. Without wasting any time, I'll now move over to Pedro Mzileni. The floor is yours, Pedro.
To say that again, all right. Thank you so much, Asipe, and good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me, Asipe? Ne?
Yes, Fred.
All right. So before we speak of a youth movement that will potentially transform society, we need to first take a closer look at the state of young people themselves. In other words, I argue that before any ambitious resolutions are made about how young people can unite and organize for broader transformation, we need to first transform young people themselves first. And I use the concept of young people approximately because it's a problematic concept itself. And I want to interlink young people, therefore, as a strata under the broader bracket of the working class in our country. Sociologically, I mean, therefore, that in our context, speaking of young people also encompasses and entails Black people and women as part of the motive forces and the oppressed class as a whole. So I do not compartmentalize them from the broader group of Black people, women, and working class as a whole in the country. They are rather interlinked sociologically. So what then is the state of young people and the Black working class in our country? Firstly, we find ourselves seated with a post-apartheid government that has largely failed to create the necessary institutions and systems needed to alleviate Black people out of bondage of poverty and unemployment comprehensively, sustainably, and permanently. What do I mean by this? Let me just highlight a few systematic and institutional breakdowns that we are faced with as the working class that emphasize the extent of the generational crisis that we are faced with, right? Firstly, the Department of Basic Education, which is the arm of the executive discharged with the public responsibility to educate our children, it announced last week that it can only account for 44.1% of learners who passed matric in 2020 from those who originally enrolled in grade 1 in 2008. In other words, between 2008 and 2020, our education system has lost 55.9% of learners, which is over 500,000. And nobody can account for their whereabouts, right? So between 2008 and 2020, over 500,000 of children have been lost in the system of education, and nobody can account as to where they are, right? And from this number that managed to pass last week, only 36% from that number managed to achieve a bachelor pass, right? And if you zoom these numbers down to the Eastern Cape, they are more disturbing. Less than 5% of all candidates who wrote science and maths achieved a distinction in the Eastern Cape. And we have more candidates in the Eastern Cape who write maths literacy than physical science, right? So if you have these numbers, you can never achieve tangible development as a country, and you can never have a sustainable future with these statistics at a schooling level. And I want to argue that there is no conscious activist and no truly revolutionary movement that can downplay the significance of these challenges. If we move to the higher education space, the systematic and institutional breakdowns are even more dire. Just to highlight a few things quickly, right? After the 2015-16 fees must fall protests, the government embarked on a bold program to increase access to education for the poor and also increase public subsidy financing of the system from 0.2% of the GDP to 1% of the GDP by 2022. That is what they resolved at that time, which is next year. Government is nowhere near at achieving this target. In fact, it has now taken a different approach of defunding higher education more than ever before. Currently, the 2021 budget speech tabled by the finance minister last week showed that funding towards free education has been cut, Universities are increasing fees annually, and the increasing teaching workloads on workers are not compensated or supplemented with increases in wages. And even the quality of the education offered to children of the working class in these universities is also declining, right? The gains made from the 2015 unrest are currently being used as a weapon to silence voices of the student movement and the labor movement in higher education. You often hear vice chancellors these days going on live television, boldly proclaiming that they cannot increase student accommodation facilities, lecture halls, student living allowances, permanent jobs for academics and hardworking researchers because universities in 2015 insourced workers and funded free education. So the student movement needs to be aware of the weaponization of insourcing and free education as an indirect gateway to exclude poor students and defund the humanities. Because we know that the main target of defunding higher education is to destroy the humanities and weaken its capacity to deliver groundbreaking research and a conscientized student body that can rise against these issues. So those who are in Mandela University, they need to be very careful. Very, very careful. Transformation and decolonization must not happen on documents or in statements or in this thing of a new name. It must be seen in the living wages and the learning experiences of the poor, which are currently being reversed. And COVID-19 is a conducive environment for universities and government to reverse the gains of the working class. So now that you are online, you are no longer on the ground, universities are reversing everything that has been achieved so far. I will come back to other issues during the question and answer session. I wanted to touch on the opportunities for graduates and young people generally that have been destroyed by the pandemic, and other opportunities of starting businesses and also that have also been grossly destroyed by the pandemic. Just the last 2 points then. Because now there are no systems and institutions in place to lift Black people out of underdevelopment, the working class has then taken a decision to do things for themselves, to try and liberate themselves. Many young people, and Black people generally, have now accumulated debt. Others have taken shortcuts to instant gratification, such as being corrupt. Others have taken precarious contract work opportunities that are grossly underpaying and overworking them. Others have engaged in risky, unsafe work. Others have migrated from their families and left their communities probably for good. And in all these instances and personal challenges that every young person is faced with, others have been infected with chronic diseases, mental illnesses, and even suicides that are taking place along the way, right? Others in the working class have been working for 20 years and they have nothing to show for it. There are 28-year-olds who have passed matric 10 years ago and they still do not have secured employment. Their families don't have a home. There's just a moria of unsafeness and precariousness that is facing young people in the working class broadly in the country. It therefore becomes difficult to organize the working class that is so fragmented like this, right? A working class that is indebted and faced with so many personal challenges on a daily basis. People in that situation are therefore very easy to buy out, and they are also very easy to sell out. It is difficult to organize young people and the working class that is fragmented in this manner for long-term revolutionary gains that will liberate them as a class. So before we speak about youth movements and young people collaborating and young people uniting and having this youth movement that will transform society, you need first to question what is the state of young people themselves. You need to transform young people themselves from these daily challenges that they are faced with. How do you organize people who are in debt? How do you trust people who are engaged in precarious employment conditions to be organized to liberate themselves as a class? They will forever be vulnerable to being buyed out by various forces that currently are our enemies. So The various protests that we see as I wrap up, Asip, so the various protests that you see across the country and the world, the protests by healthcare workers, by contract teachers, by academics, all these protests at the forefront are young people. They are the ones who have been at the forefront of the pandemic. And currently, all their professions are being deprofessionalized. There's a deprofessionalization of healthcare workers, a deprofessionalization of teachers, a deprofessionalization of administrators, researchers, and young academics. All these things pose a threat to the state of young people in the working class as a whole. And if there is to be one opportunity for the youth out of the COVID-19 pandemic, that opportunity is now to organize and ask the intelligentsia to sharpen its level of consciousness for the battles ahead. The youth must transform itself first, organize and collaborate with the rest of the sectors of the working class for a one united front. I'll come back for other issues as during Q&A.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for your contributions on youth movements. Colleagues, our next speaker is Yandisa Jubase. But before Yaya, you come to the floor, I wanted to remind colleagues and friends who are present here today that the chat section is open for comments and questions so that we can read them after all the speakers have shared their contributions. Yandisa Jubase, over to you.
Thank you, Asipe. Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible enough. Yes, greetings, colleagues, and special greetings to the team that put together this very important dialogue for us today. My name is Uyandisa Chubase. I am a student at Nelson Mandela University, and I work as a research assistant at the Center for Women and Gender Studies. Thank you for having me on this platform. Colleagues, indeed, we gather at a time of extreme precariousness caused by the famous global pandemic, especially in the lives of young people in South Africa. The already looming vulnerabilities of young people in our country have been further exposed, and more specifically, economic vulnerabilities. It's been interesting for me to find when I was preparing for this moment that in the past year, taking into consideration the economic hit that industry, corporate, all organizations took from the national lockdown, the most easily disposable employees in most companies and organizations have been young people, and moreover have been young women. Just to give you a stat, Stats SA already provides that across all provinces in South Africa, there are more men than women in the labor workforce, which then leaves us at a very scary reality that men continue to hold positions of authority and economic power in this country, more so after the COVID-19 pandemic. Young people in general continue to undergo deep emotional and mental distress caused by youth unemployment. Even for those who were supposedly in a better position at some stage, now find themselves unemployed after the wave of retrenchment that took place, and find themselves again at the hem of the job hunting process, which is a nightmare because of the because it is not conducive in the labor market. I then want to also touch, when we are analyzing and reflecting on the past year, particularly when we're talking about COVID-19 and what happened in COVID-19 and the impact it had on youth opportunities and challenges, right? We then talk about the reality, of course, around gender-based violence. And it's been often theorized that young women are mostly vulnerable to GBV, where there has been mainly alcohol involved or other forms of intoxication. But the one thing that COVID-19 proved to us is that the lockdown rules, when it came to alcohol, because there were times throughout the lockdown where alcohol was not available, or rather forms of intoxication was not available. But rather, I'm hearing an echo and it's disturbing me. Yes, okay, thank you.
I was saying that we find that the primary cause, as it was once theorized, that it is not intoxication, but rather it lies, the root cause lies in the psychological and societal views that in particular perpetrators have, which most of the time is men, when it comes to women. According to an article written in the African Portal, South Africa is ranked 4th worst country when it comes to GBV in the global hemisphere. This proves itself as a signal that alcohol and intoxication in general is not the primary cause, but rather the root causes of violence against women lies deep in the perceptions that men have when it comes to women, them being subordinate, and seeing them as punching bags when looming emotional frustrations start to grow. Coming to terms with this reality assists us in reviewing our response to GBV less from a point of just baseless programs or baseless responses, but rather effective, and it causes us to think, what policy posture can we take in ensuring that we really deal with the root causes, which is not alcohol or drugs or whatever, but rather really pragmatic interventions that can cause for effective ways for young people to be able to really survive and champion GBV as an issue in our country. And we all know that it has been named as the second pandemic. In one of the many speeches Ramaphosa spoke about, he said he identified it as the second pandemic to COVID-19. So yes, just moving past that. And then with the education system, which both the latter speakers had touched on, both the basic education and higher education took a very deep hit when it came to the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 forced us to reimagine our already struggling education system outside of the prisms of the conventional classroom space. The poor was already at a back foot when it came to the intersection of education and technology. We all theorized about the fourth industrial revolution to a point that we argued amongst our intellectual selves, whether it was here, whether it was coming, whether it's, but there was a lot of theory around the fourth industrial revolution and excitement and panic. But it might have arrived for the privileged part of South African people. But for the poor, it remained, and in rural areas, it remained but nothing but a far-fetched dream. Education may have successfully paused for the poor, but during lockdown, but for those in private schools and Model C schools, it continued almost seamlessly. Students were told to study from home, but the challenges faced by young people was the simplest things, such as network coverage, in rural areas. How then do you begin the discussion of a fourth industrial revolution when we are struggling to just get proper network coverage in our rural areas and in all parts of the country, right? Simplistic access to equipment such as your phones and your generic technological devices were not there. How do you then begin to work or study from home without those basic resources or the functionality in the virtual space? Now, when it also comes to education, we are provided with the opportunity to rethink how we have always offered education. I think one of the things that we can take as an opportunity is the fact that we need to have a blended learning approach when it comes to education, because what COVID-19 or the lockdown has taught us is the fact that many students tended to perform better in reality when they were working from home, and some others were struggling, So I think in order to be able to accommodate all types of learners, we need to have a system in our education system that is a blended learning approach and allow students to learn the way that it best works for them, type of thing, And then we also need to when we talk about technology particularly, I think in South Africa, we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to the attitudes towards technological advancement. I say this because in the many things that were happening during the lockdown, or rather in the past year, you know, there was the acknowledgement that some 5G towers were burnt down during the lockdown, you know. So this shows that the attitudes towards technological advancements is still at a back foot when it comes to our country, and there's work that needs to be done in ensuring that people understand what this fourth industrial revolution or this technological wave or this virtual space may be, type of thing, you know. And another thing that you could view as an opportunity or a challenge is the change in the mode of work when it comes to COVID-19. If there's anything that the pandemic taught us, it taught us that you can work from anywhere. While most jobs allow you that opportunity to do that, you know, but work can be done anywhere, even in the comfort of your home, right? But with that also came things like such as virtual fatigue, you know, where working hours were no longer the same for most people, because some people work at night when the house is quiet, others are able to work throughout the day, you know. But then it allows this adaptability or the change in the mode of work. It births us, or rather helps us to face the reality of the virtual fatigue, and also just the invasiveness that is attached to working from home. Because at first it sounded interesting and exciting and great, you know, and we all were excited that we could just sit in our homes in our pajamas and attend Zoom meetings. But at some point it became invasive, because now we struggle to differentiate between what is supposed to be a place of relaxation and home, and then with work pressures. And now you find that the anxieties of work and home intersect, and the pressures of work are not left at the office anymore, but are here. I'm wrapping up, Asipe, and just to touch a bit on the issue of entrepreneurship, right? I want to talk about how entrepreneurship was always offered as an alternative to a person just doing a 9-to-5, you know. So if you're not getting a job, think about starting a business. You know, it was always an easy conversation that we must all be entrepreneurs, when in reality, not all of us can be entrepreneurs. But even those who took the leap of faith and went into the entrepreneurial space took a hard hit. Many young people took a hard hit and were not able to come back because of the COVID-19, and could not meet their own contractual agreements in their businesses. So there is much to be said about that. And of course, we need to talk about the fact that young people died with dreams, you know. Young people died being the beam of hope, or rather the beacon of hope in our homes. And now even those who were breadwinners, you know, they are no longer there. So the mourning is twofold. There's the mourning of the soul, there's the mourning of the person, you know, but also there's the mourning of the actual reality of the fact that what then do we do now when we've educated this young person to this point and they were able to start working, but now they are no longer. So there's a lot of precariousness attached to it, and it almost feels that there's more challenges than there are opportunities. And I think I think we can just engage from there on. My facilitator says my time is up, and therefore my time is up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yandisa, for the contributions of all the issues that have intersected and affecting young people way before COVID even came to the space. Without wasting any time, we are now moving to our second last speaker, Olavela Mgidlana. Over to you, Lavela.
Hello.
Hi, Lavela, we can hear you.
You can hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
I'm just trying to make sure that I'm visible also on the video. Okay. Many thanks, ma'am, Asipe. Thank you for the opportunity. I would like to first extend a very warm greeting to my fellow panelists and the audience which have joined us today. I am Lavela Mgilana. I never complete my introduction without uzichaza uba isiduko sam ngumni, ndinguZizi, ndingujama, ndinguJadu, ndingufakathi, ndizalwa nguMamtshawe. Bethunana, before I begin, I'm from the Grassroots Community Trust in my capacity as a volunteer and a board member. I am also an engineer within the automotive industry, and I'm very happy to be here to share my solutions, to contribute to the conversation, and just to touch on the pillars that I will contribute today. I would like to share developments in the private sector as far as I have been involved in my capacity as an engineer. I would also like to share also the developments as I would be observing in the public sector. And I would also like to share my views on what is the role of us young people given the crisis that we find ourselves in our country. And I think the direness of the situation that we find ourselves in, I do not have to repeat. We are currently sitting, based on Stats SA, with about 7.1 million young people who are unemployed. And I want to begin my discussion with sort of encouraging the developments that have taken place in the private sector. Of course, when we look at the numbers in terms of unemployment, especially amongst young people, as a country, we are definitely not winning the fight. I would like to just touch base on the YES program. It was introduced in 2019 from the automotive space, which I operate in. And I have to say it was quite an encouraging program, given the amount of criticism that we can always put on our government and how frustrating the situation can be in terms of overall progressiveness within our society, especially as Black people. I take encouragement from this program. I've been in a very privileged position to mentor a group of young people. I've also been privileged before that to mentor young people within the engineering space who would need to complete their experiential training before they can actually graduate and add value to the economy. I think what I have observed is that the students coming from the YES program, they are accepted into the program with only matric. And what was encouraging was through the passionate engagements that you find from mentors that are really, really driven, that they are able to actually assimilate to what we would have perceived as very complicated engineering fraternity. And that was quite encouraging. And also, one of the things that I had observed, especially from Black young people, is the cultural misfit when they are in these spaces of the private sector. And I think as a country and as Black academics, we ought to do more to decolonize our society, because the way the fraternity operates, it's almost like we need to sort of accommodate other communities within our country, particularly communities which belong in the minority. And it's almost like they make it a point that we struggle to come to terms and to gain composure in those particular spaces. I think that is firstly one of the things we need to look at. Another point is I take a lot of encouragement still on this issue of the youth employment services, inputs from Richard Branson. And his input, which I really found to be encouraging, is private sector companies, where they operate, they need to sort of draw a circle around the spaces they operate in. And they need to take responsibility to add value to that closest school, to that closest clinic. And I think this model makes a lot of sense. I myself come from particular programs which were dedicated for high school pupils who are showing promise. And I've managed to get to the point where I am as an engineer from private sector companies taking a role which is active in our communities. And also just to touch on the issue of developments within the public sector. I think as I was going through the archives to particularly prepare for the input that I would make on this point, I had a little bit of trouble in terms of finding especially accurate figures on various age groups within the public sector, as the last reliable statistics were in the 2011 census. So we're still pending for the 2021 one. However, I just want to look at the wage bill of the public sector. Based on latest information from government, it's sitting at about 760 billion rand annually. And then if we look at the amount of civil servants in numbers, the figures are at 2.1 million people employed at civil servants in government. And when I take the wage bill and I divide it by the amount of civil servants, I get about 30K a month as income. And one of the things that I would like to propose in the spirit of providing solutions to the people is if we look at our unemployment for graduates in particular, it's sitting at 31% as we speak. And I would like to propose, and I know I might not be popular with trade unions on this, but the merits of the proposal do create the momentum that we need as a country. I think one of the things we need to look at is to revise the pension age of civil servants from the age 65 and reducing them to say age 58. And what I think would add value in that regard is that if we look at people in that age group, most of them would have fully paid their houses. Their cars will be probably fully paid. Their houses will be fully furnished. Their kids probably completed with schooling, probably also part of the unemployed youth, probably also unemployed graduates. And I would like to propose that if government and trade unions can come together and actually try to encourage the elderly people to sort of retire earlier and sort of negotiate attractive packages for them in creating way for young people. And how do I think this would benefit young people and our economy is in the sense that when young people come into the job world, they come having to buy a house, they need to buy a car, they are potentially planning a family. So if you get to give young people an opportunity based on this proposal, they have more propensity to impact the economy in so many different ways, because they still have a wide basket to fill which would touch so many industries, which could stimulate economic activity, and also we can get as government to provide some form of a saving in terms of the frustration that we might end up seeing amongst young people. I'd like to just park it there on that particular point. Another contribution I would like to make before I get to the role of young people, there is usually this popular narrative within the mainstream economist realm in South Africa that the solution to our problems is economic growth. And I've actually took some time to study the economic growth patterns since '94 in South Africa. And the period which I find to be mostly very green, if I can put it that way, is between the year 2000 and 2007. And what I miraculously fail to comprehend is the fact that from '94 up until where we are today, we've always had a stable unemployment rate just above 25% year on year. The youth unemployment rate was always at about 40+%. And it makes me wonder if we should be listening anymore to the mainstream economists, which do not form part or do not come from a similar background to ours. Therefore, what I would like to propose is, I think we as young people, and I'd like to borrow this point from my fellow panelist, Comrade Pedro Zileni, when he says, if we want to organize ourselves as young people, we need to first observe the process of transforming young people. And I think as young people, what we need to do, we need to get to a point whereby we ask fundamental questions to the powers that be, and to actually take the destiny of ourselves collectively into our own hands. And what we ought to do as young people in so doing, we should be looking at entrepreneurship. We should be innovators. We should look inward and look at our spending patterns. And I would quickly borrow from Thomas Sankara when he looks at his plate of food. What we need to do is our bowl for cereal, our plate of food for dinner. We need to look where is all of these commodities coming from. And we need to ask ourselves a question. Is this particular company so-and-so dairy, which I'm about to blend my cereal, which I'm also interested in who produces it? What is the footprint of Black beneficiation from the value chain of that particular company? We need to start asking those questions. And we need to, in organizing ourselves, we need to ensure that the movement that I'll be proposing, that we become as young people, looks into placing an effort into playing a role in all the industries that our consumption patterns are based on as Black people. Because if we really look at the example of, for example, China and how they deal with your German automakers, before those companies actually open a factory or facility there, one of the key things that the government of China actually negotiates is to ensure that they have some form of a parity when it comes to the profits and the revenues that would come from their market as the Chinese people, because they take their numbers as over 1 billion population as a capital on its own, and with the propensity to actually make a lot of revenue or profit for an investor which is coming from externally. So like Clem Santa would have suggested in the very famous debate, the Royal in the Urban Jungle in Stellenbosch, I think in 2017, where he debated with Julius Day. One of the things he contributed, which I feel were important, was if we want to create 5 million jobs, we need to open 1 million businesses. So what we ought to do is, as young people, we need to take advantage of social media, and we need to start also trying to be pioneers, trying to be innovators, and have our own alternative platforms which are created by ourselves. And
I'm sorry, Lavela.
yes.
So sorry, but I'll have to cut you due to time, so you can share when you do Q&A.
Can I please conclude?
1 minute.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. Okay, so what we ought to do is, for example, I read in the Herald newspaper, a young man from KwaNobuhle published a book about the struggles of a young Black man in the township, etc. What we ought to do as young people, we ought to converge. We ought to ensure that we support every initiative that one of our own presents in the mainstream. And in that way, we will be in a position to create the employment that we so lack within our country, and to get to a point whereby we can circulate our own currency amongst each other, and to champion economic emancipation. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Avela, for your contribution. We now move to our last speaker, which is Undombo Yolinda. I see colleagues' comments are coming in. Please keep them coming. We will read them during the Q&A. Ndombo Yolinda, over to you.
All right, afternoon, everyone. Hope I'm audible. It's always a pleasure meeting and convening.
Yes,
okay, great. It's always a pleasure meeting and convening in these spaces. And today is particularly refreshing for me because I'm sharing the platform with so many colleagues in the space, and the contributions have been absolutely thrilling. But I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll skip the formalities and just offer a greeting to the whole house, acknowledging and honoring all identities that are present here today. You know, as soon as I saw the title of this discussion series, Youth and Democracy, I started thinking about how the concept of youth needs to be disentangled from infantilization. You know, like the idea that as young people, we can only think at a particular level, or that we can only talk about youth issues, or that youth issues are actually separate from the whole. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has in many ways highlighted a profound desire for change collectively. That's been the energy, that's been the atmosphere everywhere. But also, as I was listening to Nontando, as she was alluding earlier to the need for collaboration or the huddling together of various communities, I thought about how that has also highlighted the extensive reach, the extensive range, and the extensive role that youth presently play in society. And please listen to me carefully. I'm not talking about the role that youth can play or will play. I'm talking about the work, the physical labor, the intellectual contributions, the leadership that we practice in our various locations, the care and support we provide in our homes and for our families, the work that we are doing as the youth right now. And I think that's important to note, because everything that concerns us, I don't know, it always seems to be reserved for like some unknown day in the future, or like premised on a lack of trust in our judgment or our reason or even our capacity, but as well as a limitation in accessing all these locked spaces. And I want to make the point I'm making, being very mindful that the conversation as we continue here today should also try as much as possible to steer away from totalizing assumptions and advancing essentialist reductions about the youth. You know, like at the end of the day, in my opinion, there's no state of affairs in the economy when it comes to development or otherwise that doesn't concern the youth, or that isn't influenced by the youth. I'm talking healthcare, I'm talking education, labor, land, governance, conflict, pandemics themselves. And I think it's interesting that at the basic level of the definition of the term youth, there seems to be a contradiction that's operating there. in terms of what youth stands for. It's almost like we're perceived to be simultaneously emerging and skilled at the same time, like we're experienced and then we're non-experienced. And the term is like, it's like empty and it's loaded all at the same time. But most importantly, it also highlights to me a conundrum that we are also central to these issues as much as we are marginalized in these issues. And so I'd like, to think about how we can structure a conversation when the perceptions of what young people can be and not be, what we can do and not do, what we can say and not say, what we can think and not think. Really anything that is taken to be of particular to us is also what's leading us towards becoming something other than, I think, our true, authentic, sovereign, and complete selves. Now, there's already this anxiety associated with the transition from childhood to adulthood. I think that's where the majority of us are right now. And on top of that, we are repetitively limited. I mean, consider the fact that we have one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the world. Sianda, can you please turn off your mic? It's distracting you there. As Lavela was saying, we have one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the world. And a huge part of that is because of the existing markers of youth. This idea again that youth is the future, which actually acts as a way to regulate youth bodies rather than empower youth bodies. And this is often a burden that's also shared amongst other bodies as well. Like Pedro was mentioning earlier, the state of young people is also integrally linked to the politics of the working class, of the politics of women and Black women in particular. And so it's like we're almost positioned as a biological movement that's in perpetual transition. And I think that's where most of our needs are actually not extended to the dignity that they deserve. Now, the pandemic has not only intensified inequalities, reducing our productive capital, but we also know that it's disrupted education. Noltando mentioned this. And something else I'm interested in is how confinement-related psychological distress has also changed the family and the social lives of youth, like our daily routines, our movements, our mental health, our income. But after all that's said and done, the pandemic has also intensified a pressing need for us to pay attention to the resilience of young people. And this has taken me to my first point. I mean, think about it. As young people, most of us have experienced a surplus of global shocks throughout our lives. Like boom, you're born and there's the HIV pandemic. And then there's the internet pandemic, the boom of the internet. And then there was the 2008 global financial crisis. And then, there's climate change. And then there's social media. Oh my God, Ebola. And then there was the H1N1 virus. You guys remember that? Okay, there was Donald Trump and Jacob Zuma. And now we've got the COVID-19 pandemic and we've seen all the drama. And of course, the exposure to such shocks has long-lasting consequences for our access to decent employment. This is what Lavela was also mentioning, and health and other dimensions of well-being and other opportunities. But it's also strengthened our resilience, and this is the point I'm trying to make. Already prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, young people have been at the forefront of calls for a longer-term perspective in policymaking and in building more inclusive and sustainable societies. And I think that a resilience as a positive youth development construct can be very crucial in ensuring the anti-fragility of public institutions and governments against future shocks. Just because of the nature of the complex realities and experiences that we face, which are constantly interlocking and intersecting across and through multiple identities and proficiencies. And that means that we can add a very unique value. But then again, as I'm saying this, I want to remain accountable to myself in non-essentializing youth as a category. And so I want us to focus on the point that I'm making is that we need to hear youth voices and not just see youth bodies. And that's why in terms of opportunities, I think we should stop this nonsense of talking about influencing public policy and all of this stuff. No. We actually need to be part of the policy and decision makers. And I think that this is what the pandemic has really highlighted for me. I was just thinking, actually, I had a thought this morning as I was waking up, like in order for you to rebel and to stand against a bully, rather. You need to rebel, right? And what are the bullies that exist in our societies? Poverty is a bully. Political bureaucracy is a bully. Capitalist constructions of our experiences is bullyism. I'm saying we need to rebel. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Ntombovuyo. Thank you to you all. I'm just looking at the chat section and I see there are so many comments and so many questions. I'll just go and read them and for the speakers to answer. There's no order. I'm just gonna tell the question and then give over to whoever the question was asked to, and then to the speakers to add on if they want to. Also, colleagues, just to alert you that you can also raise your hand if you see that option. You can also alert me in the chat section that you want to raise your hand. I'm just gonna go through the comments and read them. If you want to articulate your comment by yourself, you can also do that by alerting me in the chat section. Colleagues, there's a comment and a question. So this comment is for Pedro. Thank you for such a thoughtful contribution. You've raised such interesting questions in my mind regarding the theorization of social movements during the pandemic. One of them is that while COVID has forcefully reimagined how mobilization for youth, has it also forced a reframing of long-standing issues like racism or even surveillance in the workplace? And another question that followed was for Yandisa. You've drawn such beautiful connections between the invasiveness of work in the home environment. In what ways do you think this has challenged our perception of what professionalism is and who is imaged or imagined as professional? These questions come from Unobubele Poza. The other one comes from, it's a question to Pedro. His view of promoting the idea that there is a need for young people to focus at the status of where they are at present and first build or transform them before engaging in programs of unity with other structures to mobilize for whatsoever cause. I think it is a good point. That's a comment. But I would like to ask him on how does he seize the fact that young people in general see themselves as being productive once they enter the university's grounds and be active in university student structures, while at the school level, where many of them are from, it is very dark and dull there. In short, they neglect the youth there. What role the youth who are leading at the universities see themselves playing in addressing such a challenge at school level? Are there any pen pal that are existing, like university school SRC partnerships of sort? Because they are also SRC at high schools. I hope my question is clear. Colleagues will just move to Pedro and Yandisa to answer these questions, and then I'll go again for another round. Pedro?
Thanks, Osipe. Quickly, I'll just make 4 comments to respond to the questions in front of me. Firstly, the COVID-19 pandemic has destroyed opportunities of employment for graduates and young people generally. And this is in South Africa and across the world. And we know that the collapse of the economy globally, its main victims are going to be young people, especially those who are new graduates and those who are currently tied to unprotected labor contracts. Basically, those who don't have permanent employment at the moment. So in other words, the quality of all our qualifications will definitely drop as a result of the economic meltdown, and companies are going to maximize out of this crisis by exploiting it further, by refusing to employ new graduates and further retrench those who are currently in 3-month and 12-month contracts. So people who have undergraduate degrees, honors, masters, you name them. The way now the economy is going to move, moving ahead, you are no longer safe as a labor force with those qualifications. In fact, the market now can determine a totally new different standard in terms of what it requires out of the labor force. So there is no one who is at risk out of this pandemic other than young people and the working class as a whole. And even the value of education itself, it has definitely been eroded by this crisis. And these are the questions that should be placed on the table in terms of what do they mean now, therefore, for the state of young people. There's definitely a further crisis looming as we move ahead, and we definitely don't have institutions in place to reverse this tide. There's someone who spoke about entrepreneurship and starting businesses. I hear that comment a lot. Whenever there's a crisis, young people must go and be entrepreneurial. You're going to be an entrepreneur using which systems? Which institutions are in place to avail those opportunities? Because we don't have them at the moment. Just a quick fact. At the moment, the only institutions that are empowered to issue credit that is affordable to people are the central banks of this country. ABSA, Standard Bank, FNB, you name them. And those institutions, they are still embedded in funding the established markets in the mining, manufacturing, energy, and agricultural complex. They are not going to fund a person without assets, or a young person, or a 26-year-old from university who doesn't have a financial history, or a credit history, or an asset ownership history. You won't get support from FNB. So there are no institutions in place. And don't tell me about NYDA and SIDA. Those things are jokes, right? You won't start a sustainable business that will create decent employment using NYDA. It's impossible. So we need a state bank in South Africa. A state bank that will progressively fund the poor and the working class to start businesses, and also turn the stockfields that are being utilized by women in our communities into sustainable enterprises. It is only a state bank that can cut into that gap that we have in the market, where people who do well academically, their debts are wiped out, and you start on a clean slate. If you have a good business idea, a state bank is there to support you to start your business sustainably. Do we have those institutions? No. Do we have potential to begin those institutions? No. So there's no banking strategy in South Africa geared towards the needs of Black people. We don't have it. And there's no vision at all at the moment to create it. The last 2 points, Asipe. I want to move quickly because of time. I agree with the Communist Party when it says that if we indeed claim that we are biased to the poor and the marginalized, and we anchor our social interventions on social justice, then we need to utilize different models to measure the level of our progress. For instance, they argue that when one calculates economic growth, they can't rely on models provided by the Chicago School of Economics, which looks at the fluctuations of the GDP. Rather, we should measure our growth of our economy by how we tackle poverty and create decent jobs for our people. And this brings me to the question of how we measure progress in public education. We need to anchor our scale to measure the progress on how many children started grade 1 in 2020 and how many will complete grade 12 in 2023, 2032, I mean. So those who are going to start grade 1 this year, how many will complete grade 12 in 2032? And secondly, how many distinctions are we going to achieve from our townships and rural areas for physical science and maths? If we are indeed revolutionaries, we should use this parameter, comrades. You see? When we look at the results of education, both higher education and basic education at the moment, we need to ask ourselves about those who have lost their loved ones during the pandemic, and those who have dropped out and disappeared completely from the system. And we need to ask, how do we recover them? How do we recover those people that we have lost in the system? Instead of celebrating perseverance, these young people, against all odds, they are persevering. No. Revolutionaries ask themselves critical questions as to those who lost family members. A person who lost a mother and a father during the pandemic, how do you expect that person to function again in the system? And what do we do with such people? How do we find them, recover them, rehabilitate and integrate them back into the system, right? The workers who have suffered, the workers who are being deprofessionalized, what subsidies are in place to ensure that their work comes back to being protected and decent, and so that they can grow their families and so on, moving ahead? My last point, the question of a youth movement, right? That's why I said one opportunity that COVID has provided for young people is an opportunity to organize, right? And by organizing, you can't be organized by people who are not conscientized, right? You can't organize by people who are faced with daily challenges of being in debt. There was a speaker who spoke about us getting cars and houses on credit. So you're pushing us back the very same crisis we're trying to run away from, being in debt, right? You are in debt in your fees in university. You are in debt for owning a car that you can't afford. You are in debt for buying a house that you can't afford. I mean, all these things, they are creating what I would like to call today a pedagogy of debt. You know how a person who's in debt, how they think? They never think about the long term. They think about the next available income that they can accumulate now, whether illegally or legally. Anything that they can accumulate now for their own selfish ends. So when you have...
Thank you so much, Pedro. I'm sorry I had to cut you due to time. There was a question for Chubase. Chubase, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Asipe. I'll be very short. Thanks, Nobu, for your question. I think I'd like to first then begin around what then we understand, of course, as the perception of what professionalism was before COVID-19. I mean, most people believed or perceived professionalism to be a 9-to-5, an office corner, a navy and black, and that was naturally what professionalism was deemed to be. The idea of the fact that you go to an office every day and you come back at 5 o'clock and you wear dull clothing most of the time, and what COVID-19 then also just sort of broke, like I said, is the idea around the fact that you can work from anywhere. So the 9-to-5 immediately falls away, right? And then there's productivity even within. You don't have to be working within those hours in a particular geographical space in order for you to be deemed as professional. And professionalism then, the perceptions around professionalism is more about productivity now than it is about where you at, what you're wearing, and the sort of office etiquette that is required with professionalism. And I also just want to touch on the invasiveness part when it comes to working from home, and the idea of what professionalism then is at home, because at home there are kids, and one moment you are in a Zoom meeting and then your child is in front of the camera, and you cannot deem that as unprofessional, because the invasiveness of what working from home deems that your professional space. It intersects the idea of being at home and being professional. So in essence, COVID-19 then changed the whole idea of what you wear, what you do, but rather really, really helps us focus on rather the productivity and what we're able to do with our time in the professional space. So I think there's a whole new different notion of what professionalism is after COVID-19, and the need even to be at an office, to wake up every day and go to an office. you know. But I do also want to talk about how at some point it does sort of affect even our elderly family members who identify success or kind of professionalism with you going every day, leaving home and going to work, you know, and deeming that as success, you know. And those are the perceptions now that we need to deal with, because most people don't understand the concept of why you're working from home, you know, because home is a place where you just come back after work type of thing. So I hope I answered your question. I'm not sure, but yeah, the whole idea of professionalism has really changed.
Thank you so much, Yandisa. I am noting your hand, Pilar. I'll just read the comments and the questions in the chat section, and then we'll give over to you in this round. There's a question from Siamama who's saying, my question is to Lavela. With his proposal that pension should be at 58, how do we guide and ensure that does not extend the austerity measures employed by the South African government, given what is currently happening in South Africa with health workers' contracts not being renewed, while we have lost a number of them during the pandemic? There's another question by Unobubele from Dombovuyo. Nobele says, I'm sending this question prematurely, but I am moved by opening statements regarding the crisis of representation in the public sphere, exacerbated during the pandemic. There has been so many flaws of the construction of the public sphere, and are ignoring poor and rural voices and centering middle class in discussions about public sphere. I am asking then that as the pandemic has taken work from people, we have seen a decline in the middle class and a rise in the poor. Have you seen, felt, imagined a new way for youth to find new spaces in the public sphere? Another question from Sam Bainon. Sam is sending a question for Ndombovuyo. I was touched by your opening remarks on the state of democratic public institutions. I do believe that a trust deficit between them and young people exists, justifiably so, and that representation in decision-making remains low among young people. At the same time, this doesn't mean young people are ineffective. Young people are vocal in public debates through non-institutionalized channels of participation. How would you propose that participation in decision-making by young people becomes normalized in democratic public institutions in order to ensure their legitimacy and to achieve more responsive and sustainable policies? So those are the questions that are currently in the chat section. I will now hand over to Pilar, who had a hand up. Over to you, Pilar.
Thank you, Asipe. My name is Gu Pilar. I'm a student at the Nelson Mandela University. I also joined late. I missed the first two speakers, so apologies for that. So I'll try to be short and organize my thoughts. I don't really have questions, but some reactions to what I managed to listen. So what I could pick up from the panelists is that we all agree that the pandemic has magnified what was already there. So what was already existing. And so there's nothing new that it showed us, it just magnified it for us. And so if we look, for example, at the unemployment rate, right? So if we look now at the unemployed graduates and unemployed young people, it's almost like the youth cohort is the reserves. If you remember, during the apartheid times, the rural areas would be called the reserves for providing labor to the mines. So what we see in the townships and in the rural areas now are graduates who are waiting in the reserves to be called when someone retires or leaves the workplace. So the system has been like that. Nothing has changed. We have just replaced our our fathers as mine workers, but now we sell our labor as graduates to the system again. So I think what can help us there is that let us also, when we think of maybe unemployment of the youth, let us not think of just selling our labor to the system, but also selling our labor to ourselves, which is what maybe Untombovio was touching on, to say, let us be part of the policy making. And Ulavela talked about entrepreneurship and so on. So, but when we think of the solutions, like how do we organize ourselves as young people, I concur with Untombovuyo in that we first need to position ourselves. We need to be in charge. That is, to be in charge in the policy space, in the directorates and so on, and all the strategic positions. So we need to be in charge. And I view maybe the opportunities or the solutions to be dynamic and not come from one direction. So we may look at remodeling new patterns of consumption of the youth, and maybe tone down on the conspicuous consumption. And then our intellectual labor, because this, I believe that the opportunities or the solutions are generational. We may not all achieve them in our generation. I think our generation should be setting the foundation for the coming generation, because these short-term solutions, they don't work because the system suffocates them. So we need to lay a foundation that will elevate us out or above the system that we currently find ourselves in. But I also want to respond to Ulavela. I liked his proposal of the model for private sector companies to say they must look in a close radius around where they work, the schools, the townships, and so forth. That is one solution that could work. But on the early retirement, the age of 58, we must also bear in mind that our parents, when we are retrenched from these short-term contracts and precarious employment, they absorb the bill for us. They pay our cars when we buy cars we don't afford. They are the ones who give us money for data and so on and so forth. So when they retire early, obviously, they may earn less and not be able to shoulder that burden. So there might be some risks associated with the early retirement of parents. We've seen people who have retired and went back to work because...
So sorry, Pilar, I had to cut you. You can finish off in the chat section. Due to time, colleagues, I am trying to allow everyone to be able to share their comments and questions, and also just to give time to the speakers to add to the contribution, as well as be able to answer some of the questions that were posed. I will now hand over just briefly to Ulavela to respond to the question that was posed to him, and also to Untombovuyo to respond. And then after that, I'll look into the chat section to see if there are any questions which will be combined with closing remarks by the speakers. Lavela, briefly, please answer the question that was posed to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. To be honest, the question from Siyamama, if we could please maybe just clarify, because I see he touches on the proposal for pension at 58, and I don't really get where the question is directed. I'm not, if you can please just shed light for me.
Okay, I think Usia can just write in the chat section to elaborate more so that Lavela can answer during the closing statements after Ntombovuyo has responded. Ntombovuyo?
Sorry, I was muted. I didn't realize I was on mute. So I actually want to questions just to translate, I want to cluster those two questions from Nobu and Sam, because I think they're very, they're related. Nobu was asking whether I've imagined new ways for youth to find spaces in the public sphere. And Sam was asking, how do we then ensure that participation in decision-making by young people becomes normalized in public institutions? And I'll give you both an answer, one answer. Yeah. Who's that? Okay. So firstly, I think that we need to note there's a mutual distrust between political parties and young people. And so for me, it's about finding new ways of engaging with the state, of rethinking what democracy means for us and how we engage with government. So in a way where our capacity doesn't constantly have to be negotiated, I find that we always have to prove our worth when it comes to being active in these public spaces. So I don't think I really have a solid proposal, but I do know that, the current political systems are not working for us. And let's bear in mind, guys, that, whatever powers may be, will actually not willingly share this power with us. So I think we need to create power centers that work for us and for our own interests. And I also want us to be very intentional in these conversations in challenging the perception that youth is a social category that needs to be fixed. But Asipe, I don't know if you'll allow me. I saw another question that I think I really want to touch on. Do you rather want me to come back to that at the end, or can I get into it?
You can get into it briefly, Mama, or you can touch on it when you're closing off.
Okay, that's fine. We'll touch on it when we finish. So yes, to Sam and Nobu, that's what I would have to say. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, colleagues, for the engagements. We are not yet done. I'll now hand over to all the speakers just to briefly give closing remarks, 2 minutes maximum. I'll start with Unoluthando or Nono. You can either touch base on the questions that were shared in the chat section and as well as verbally, or do closing remarks based on your contributions. Over to you, Nolthando.
Thanks again, Asipe. Just a few things on the questions that have been asked. One, I think that when it comes to questions around whether or not a certain age limit should be placed on retirement and things like that, I think that on its own is a discussion that requires understanding the kind of experiences that a lot of people have insofar as it relates to their capacity to access just money, or even just be able to access income that allows them to be able to functionally work around the kind of problems they might be dealing with on a regular basis. And how that is something that more often than not is something that relates itself largely to things like how they're able to access that income, who has access to the ability to access education, and how far that is something that changes the lived reality that they have. So I think lastly, just a conclusion of what I've already said is that democracies, or democracy in South Africa particularly, is in trouble for various reasons. The COVID-19 pandemic has only been able to make that something that is far more clear. We need to have a far more structural mechanism of responding to issues of access to not only education, but healthcare and various other aspects that are needed by people and the rest of society. And that in essence, to just respond to COVID-19 and various other things that could come as a result of the changing global systems, the changing global warming and various other things in terms of climate change, we're definitely going to need to look into making sure that the more important sectors are ones that we are going to beef up through allowing access to those sectors, be it through education and training, or even just being through getting more money into those spaces. Thanks.
Thank you, Nolutando. We'll move to Ulavela. And also, if you are now ready to answer the question, you can also ask it. You can also answer it. Over to you, Ulavela.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. Just to quickly summarize and conclude, one of my submissions with my proposal as young people having to converge, and we are in our millions in South Africa. Many of us are unemployed, many of us are in the middle class, many of us are in institutions of higher learning, and there is encouragement that I take from one of the points that Dombovuyo proposed about as young people playing a pivotal role in policy making. I think one of the questions that are never asked, given the crisis in our country, and we need to take it up as young people, the proceeds of our minerals, where are they going? Because if you look, for example, the countries in the Persian Gulf, your Qatar, your UAE, your Saudi Arabia, the standard of living in those countries is so high because the proceeds from their mineral resources translate into beneficiation of their citizenry. I think this is a question that we need to look into, and we need to hold the bull by the horn, and we need to make the authorities answerable when it comes to these particular dynamics around the mineral beneficiation complex. On the issue of the pension age, I didn't get the follow-up clarification from Siyamama, but this was a point to try and assist the dynamic and the potential that young people, as recent graduates, the value that they can bring to our public spaces. And I think one of the panelists, I forgot the name, also mentioned a point about professionalizing our institutions. And I think young people can provide that dynamic. Thank you, Asif.
Thank you so much, Lavela. Yandisa Chubase, closing statements.
Thanks, Asipe. Just my closing statements is, I think what I'm taking away, or rather just an emphasis, is what Pedro spoke about in terms of mobilization and organizing young people in the midst of the pandemic. You know, I think we really need to reimagine what activism is or social movements are post-pandemic, and how then do we organize ourselves as young people when there's so much that divides us. So I do think that that in itself is a discussion that must be had, and I would love to actually really think about it further. But I really do think that in terms of mobilizing young people and just really organizing, because there's much that unites us, but there's much that divides us as well, you know, not to sound rhetorically, but that is the truth. So I really would like us to think further, perhaps in any other discussion, how then we can mobilize each other. Other than that, I think I'm pretty clear, and I'd like to say thank you to the fellow panelists and to you, the facilitator, for everything that you've done for us today. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Pedro. Dombovuyo.
What a fire engagement, guys. It's been so great. I actually just wish it was in person so that we can continue some of the discussions here. And really, most of your questions and comments have also propelled us to think further on some of these topics. And it's really not us about being here as panelists and answering all of these questions as if we're the experts, but it's about thinking together. And one of the questions that stood out for me, Asipe, but you didn't read it, but it was there in the comment section, and I really, really thought it was so interesting, that was asked by Mrs. Kani. And she was asking when being the youth suits the youth and when it hurts the youth. And I think it really also links with what I'd like to say and what I was saying even earlier. Look, I think the effects of the pandemic have really shown how the descriptive conditions of youth culture actually are disguised as, like important differences and distinctions. They disguise all of these things, class and the variety of ways that young people can be seen or to relate with dominant culture. And I think we need to start thinking more about more meaningful ways of conceptualizing and speaking about the youth. I think that's what the majority of my arguments were centered around. How do we analyze the different ways that we can show up against even our own conceptual limits? And maybe even recognize that some of the attempts that we use to assert the meaning of youth identity actually undermines how we can function more efficiently and effectively. So I think there needs to be a paradigm shift with regards to popular discourses about youth when attempts are made to understand and explain the behavior of young people and to explain the resistance of young people and our various expressions. Thanks, everyone. It was good.
Thank you so much, Dombovuyo. I enjoyed the discussion. It was robust and it was a discussion that is much needed. And my worry throughout the discussion, even what Pedro was saying about how we keep on discussing transformation and decolonization without necessarily taking stance into actually practicing what we're discussing. I'm worried about the addition of the shift in transformation with regards to the pandemic, because now we are even again moving to more discussions. Hopefully we will actually do have actions towards an action plan with all the strategies that we are discussing in dealing with the socioeconomic issues that are facing young people in South Africa, and trying to work towards assisting our country in good governance and in this democratic decline. Colleagues, we've now come to the end of the discussion, but we obviously cannot end a discussion, a dialogue, without hearing from the organizers. So I'll now hand over to Botsonwabo Stirman to do the vote of thanks. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Asipe. Quite an exciting engagement. As I'm sitting here, I was, reminded of a conversation that Steve Biko once had when he was a student a long time ago. And he was asked, Babu Biko, why is Black consciousness philosophy resonate with young people? And I was quite intrigued by his response, as I was engaging the archives. And then he says, because Black consciousness philosophy seeks to infuse the Black community with a newfound pride in themselves, their efforts, their value systems, their culture, their religion, and their outlook to life. So as I was listening to these great young minds today, I was reminded, of those philosophical stances. And I'm sure as we are engaging, Abantu Abafana noBabu Steve Biko, who were young people themselves, who were striving to see, this new vision and the new outlook as far as the young people are concerned, particularly Black communities. So now, I'm sure as they are listening in spirit, their bones, and their souls are shaking. So ndiyabulela kakhulu kwi-speakers bekukuhle kakhulu. And also, as we are celebrating, colleagues, this very profound partnership between CAS and Kenred, we are commemorating a 5-year strong and healthy partnership with CAS. They are the ones who are providing us with necessary resources to make sure that we get the young people to create platforms of engagement. So on behalf of Kenred and the university, I would like to extend once again our gratitude to Unensi, who is representing the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. She is based in Pretoria. And also Phakama Mlokoti, who has set the tone when she was offering a profound poem relating to the theme of the day. Phakama sifuna ukuthi siswam kuwe, as the poet of eGqeberha, siyabulela kakhulu kuwe ntombazana nangam. So to my speakers, you know, andinamlomo ngokwesiXhosa, to uNoluthando Honono, uPedro Mzileni, uYandisa Jubase, uLavela Mgidlana, uNtombuvuyo Linda, kuni Maqhawe nawe Maqhawekazana, sifuna ukuthi siyabulela kakhulu. Ndinitholela umnqwazi ndifuna ukuthi nangomso. To Asiphe, who has facilitated this dialogue professionally and so profoundly. We are on time. I was a bit scared and skeptical initially that the discussion of this nature would take us beyond 5 o'clock, but we are 5 minutes before 5. So that means, Asiphe, the way you have handled discussions today, it was highly, highly professionalized, and I appreciate that. Last but not least, colleagues, to the beautiful audience, you know, the friends of Kindred, the allies, comrades, people across. I see people from Forte, from the University of Pretoria, they're here. I can mention the few, as well as our sister institutions at the Walter Sisulu University. I want to acknowledge you as well. Everyone who has been part of this. I always say it's not easy to be online. It's not easy to engage virtually, to stay online for at least 2 hours, because it data iyadura. But here we are still in big numbers, appreciating this moment. Siyabulela kakhulu, sifuna ukuthi kuye wonke umuntu who was part of this conversation from the bottom of our hearts. Sifuna ukuthi thank you so much. And lastly, to Umak, who is making sure that we have the recordings and the records and the archives after this program. He's the man who is behind our information technology and media. Umako Fabri. Nawe Marco, I want to acknowledge you, my brother. Asiphe, sabulela kakhulu, my sister. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. S. We can now turn on our videos and just say bye to everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Prof. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, bye, everyone.
Bye, colleagues. Bye, Nobu.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye, everyone.